Hi, everyone. I am so glad that you are joining me again today for another person that I want to introduce you to. Because remember, this whole entire year, my goal has been to let you know what else is going on in the world with what people are doing with teens or for teens and ideas that can be so helpful to you. So today I have Michael Laidler with me, and he has a book and he is a speaker that travels around, and he also has a podcast. So I'm going to let him talk to you about all the things. But what I love about this conversation, and we'll add these things in here in a minute, there's so much about UMAP that we can talk about with again, really any guest, but especially I found these connections with Michael when we talked earlier. So I'm excited for you to see how UMAP can fit into your life, no matter who you are or what you're doing. So, Michael, tell us about yourself.
Well, first and foremost, Cynthia, thank you for giving me the chance to speak to your audience, giving me the opportunity to pour into you guys some of the things I've been through in my life. For me, it's taken a long time for me to kind of realize some things that I thought I should have known about myself, but I didn't. And what I love about your podcast is the group that you target, that's where it starts. It starts
Mhm.
off at that time before you turn 18. I was wrong because I didn't realize that. When I start
Mhm.
looking at my own self-awareness journey, I start looking at things that happened to me as an adult. And I didn't really dial back in and kind of peel away that onion where I was like, you know what? What's been going on with Michael Laidler before? And as I got older and as I got more involved in different things, self-awareness, UMAP, programs of that nature, I started to realize that I've been shaped by the events that happened before I can even put on a uniform as a law enforcement officer or before I went to college, before I even left the house. And for me, when I started to really pay attention to self awareness and I really got into it, I was like, you know what? This is who I am as a person. It's just not me waking up saying, I'm going to dismiss everything. So for me, I was born and raised in Miami, Florida, single mother, handicapped grandmother, no father in my life. We were not the richest family by no means. We moved practically every year, and that was because we couldn't afford to stay. We went through eviction processes. We went through sleeping on couches. I mean, for the longest in my life growing up, I thought trash bags were dresser drawers. Like I
Mhm.
really thought that was normal because I didn't know any better. Like I know,
Mhm.
like for example, my son, he has two different houses because me and his mother are divorced. So my son doesn't know that, hey, you got two separate beds in two different houses. For me, I grew up either staying in a room with my mother, my sister, my grandmother, or cousin up until I went to college. So from
Mhm.
early on, I faced things that I didn't always pay attention to. And what I realized is that it put me in a survival mindset. It put me in a mindset that I was like, you know what? Whatever just comes to me, I'm just going to accept it because whatever I get now is better than what I had before. And it took me so many years to realize that living in a survival mindset, it didn't really help me or the people around me out. And it really wasn't until I turned 35 when I was like, you know what? I need to kind of look back at why I'm just taking things for granted. Don't get me wrong, my years from 18 to 35 wasn't bad at all. It wasn't like I was suffering. It wasn't like I was going through hard times as an adult, but I wasn't thriving. And I things I do now, as Cynthia mentioned earlier, a podcast, a book, professional speaking, speaking across seas, I would have never pushed myself that hard because I was like, you know what? I have a good government job. I have exactly what I need. Every 2 weeks, I get paid. I have health insurance. I have dental insurance. But I kept going back to I don't feel fulfilled. I feel like I'm not doing enough. And it really started off going back to my teenage years, literally realizing that those events, such as being homeless and staying with family and friends, and even sometimes staying with them not having electricity. I mean, it put me in a mindset that I definitely want your viewers to understand that you may think everything's normal right now, but you should take a self assessment and look at where you can be at, not where everybody else wants you to be, but where you specifically need to be. So for me, that's where I grew up. And then I got into law enforcement at the age of 19. I was a police officer. Then I eventually became a border patrol agent. And then I got into federal corrections. I had leadership roles. I eventually opened up a business. I have a son, and all of that is just shaped by different events in my life, and I'm sure we'll get into a little bit today, but it has allowed me to go out and explore the world. Has that allowed me to now get better? Because going back to just self-awareness and realizing where I came from is what's helping me out today.
I love that. Well, as I've been doing this work, I found out that self awareness is the number one predictor of success in life. And our teens don't know themselves very well, and it's normal, or it's natural that they wouldn't know because they're still trying to figure it out. But I don't think they realize they even should be looking at who they are. So when you encounter teens, what do you say to them about the self-awareness piece, and how do they start figuring that out?
Well, there's so many different assessments. I know one of the ones we've talked about in the past was like Clifton Strengths. That always gives you a pretty good starting point to kind of
Mhm.
start building yourself and kind of realizing, okay, this is my style. And don't get me
Mhm.
wrong, styles change,
Mhm.
but everybody does have a style. I mean, that's just the truth. And something like Clifton Strengths will at least give you a general idea of your top 5 strengths. Now you can
Mhm.
get up to 34 in that assessment, but usually the top 5 are going to be the ones that most relate to you right now. Like for me, for example, my number one strength is a learner. I took the assessment 5 years ago. I took it again recently in this past year, and it was still a learner. So
Mhm.
some of the other parts changed, but not really drastically. Like my number 2 went to number 4, my number 3 went off, but then my number 6 went down to number 2. So
Mhm.
overall, getting self-assessments continuously really helps out. So for that teenager that's like, well, I don't know where I want to go. Well, who are you right now first? Don't go too far ahead without understanding who you are and finding different things that you map, Clifton Strengths, other self-assessment tools really is where I would start. And then once you get into that self-assessment cycle, go find yourself a mentor. Go find somebody that is a step or two ahead of you, not 30 years away from you because they're not going to know, but someone that's maybe just 1 or 2 steps away from where you're trying to get to, and start asking them for advice. Say, hey, how did you get here? What obstacle did you face? What did you have to learn? What did you have to pay for? Else did you
Mhm.
have to meet? Who else should I meet? All those are questions that you can get with the mentor on. And obviously, that should be a person that you can relate to in one way or another. But that if you see a certain direction you want to go, find a person in that area. So for self-assessments, or self-awareness, I would start with getting some kind of assessment right out the gate and kind of seeing, and then kind of build it from there. But don't wait, because you might say, well, I'm only 15, I'm only 16, I'm only 17. Oh, I'm 13. Yeah, but you have people building their career from that point forward. You
Mhm.
can fit in that same role. You don't have to look and wait for someone to come bring you along, because like for me, that never really happened until I started
Mhm.
to realize that I had to get better on my own. And then I started to find the mentors, the ones that I found out was for me versus people just randomly following me. So for me, it starts off with you as a person, but especially as a teenager, I can tell you, I wish I knew at 38 right now, I wish I knew this at 15 and 16. And I actually cared and listened, because I would
Mhm.
be so much further and so much different where I'm at today. And I can tell you, people that are older, people that are within my age group, they all say the same thing. They're like, man, I wish I knew more about myself back then, because as you know, time goes by fast. Before you know it, you'll be 38. Before you know
Mhm.
it, you'll be 75. And you're like, what? Why didn't I do this at 16? But it
Mhm.
starts off just looking at that self-awareness, self-reflection tools to kind of get you going on the process.
I have said that so much because that's really why I started my podcast, because I learned so much about myself, not only in taking the UMAP, but just through life coaching. I got a life coach of my own. And that's when I started thinking, oh, I want to help other people know about this too. Because if I would have known this when I was 15, I would have made different decisions. Now, that doesn't mean that some of the decisions wouldn't have been the same, or I'm glad that the decisions I made, even though I would make them differently, didn't bring me some amazing things that I'm glad that I have. But I think I could have been much more successful in the earlier part of my life instead of kind of floundering around trying to figure things out if I would have known these things about myself. And so one of the things, you're talking about Clifton Strengths, which I think my listeners, if they listen to a lot of my episodes, know that the UMAP uses Clifton Strengths. So it's so
Mhm.
perfect that you're mentioning that and that you've actually been through that. But when you said learner, and a learner is just somebody who, likes to know a lot of knowledge, whether it's Googling a lot of things or actually taking classes or enjoying learning in school or learning in your career. Can you look back on your life, even back in your single digit ages, like 7, 8, 9? Can you see where learner was already there and you were using it, but you just didn't know it because you didn't know that was your strength?
Cynthia, going back that far, and
Maybe
it's not me.
I went too far.
No, 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 no. It's cool. No, no, it's fine. It's. I never really looked at it that way because in school, I used to be one of those kids that like to get my work done so fast that I wouldn't have to do it at home. So I
Mhm,
would do all my homework at school. But I
mhm,
don't remember many times when I was like, you know what? I just wanted to learn this activity. It really came into my adult years when I started to actually pay attention to, you know what? I just want to learn something new. I want to learn something different. And for me, it actually dates back only to about 15 years ago when I was in my mid 20s. And that's when I went and got my master's degree in business.
mm,
I didn't really need a master's degree in law enforcement, especially a one in business, but just through curiosity, I was like, you know what? I wonder what people in the business field do. I wonder how they think. I wonder how they formulate their ideas. So literally, I just got a master's degree in business just because I wanted to learn about that.
mm,
When I think about earlier times, just off top of my head, I don't remember anything prior to 10 that really stood out to me, or even as a teenager. I mean,
mhm,
because I knew early on I was going to be in criminal justice, and that was because I saw the O.J. Simpson trial in the mid
mm,
90s,
mhm,
and I saw that chase, the trial, and I already knew that law enforcement was going to be in my future. Now, obviously, you
mm,
can't guarantee you're going to get picked up as a police officer or an attorney or whatever that might be, but you can at least guide yourself. So early on, I did take classes for criminal justice early on, like in high school and stuff like that. But I don't think that was, to me, that wasn't learning anything out of the ordinary because that was
mhm,
me kind of learning what I was already pacing myself to do.
mhm. That's true. Learner is one of my top 5 too. That's why I was thinking about when I learned these things about myself,
Mm-hmm.
I started looking back as far as I could remember, where did these strengths kind of play in when I didn't know about it? And
Mm-hmm.
I think I can remember back to 6 and 7 where I was just picking up materials of all kinds and just reading and, like, trying to figure out
Mm-hmm.
things, and I remember my parents had these medical encyclopedias, and I just kept reading through them. And, I didn't go into that, but I was just so curious, like, how does my body work? And what does this mean? And what if I take this medicine? What happens? And I really was doing that at a very young age, and part of it's because I was bored because I grew up on a farm and I didn't wanna be there. But I also, I mean, I see how that has played into my entire life, and just all the different things that I've tried to do in my life has been about learning. So I was just curious because we have that same one in common. I don't think when you told me earlier what yours are, I don't think we have any others that I also have in my top 5, but that was one that I was like, "Oh, I have to find out if see that tendency with yourself even way before you knew."
I see it a lot now. And it's crazy because it's like once you become aware of something, as
Mhm,
we're going to continue to talk about, once you
mhm,
become aware of something that's part of you, you're like, you know what? That actually makes sense. Like,
mhm,
I can tell you, when you talk about reading books, I read books that I was required to read. I didn't read
mm,
any kind of novels growing. I mean, I wrote whatever a book report needed in elementary school, middle school, and high school. I read. In
mhm.
college, I read textbooks, but I didn't really become a reader until my mid 20s. And I was like, man, I need to expand my vocabulary and my ability to tell stories and knowledge. So
Mhm,
I started reading fiction books, and then over time, I started reading a lot of self-help leadership books. And once again, that's what sparked everything I do now. Is when I started to realize that I was a learner by nature, and I started to embrace that. So even going back to, if you're like, well, should I do this Clifton Strange, should I do this UMAP? Well, yes, because you're going to realize things that you're good at that you're not embracing. So for
mm,
me, I am a good learner, and
mhm,
I've taken the Clifton Strange twice, and my number one was learner on both of them. Like I
mhm,
said, a few other areas changed, but the learning side was something that's there. So even now, like people are like, why do you like to teach? Well, because I like to learn things. Like I
mhm,
do YouTube videos once a week, and that's on different leadership, self-awareness type topics. But when I speak about it, I have to study it first. So I have
mhm,
to learn the details of that empirical article or that other audiobook I listen to, whatever it might be. But going back to your strengths and the purpose of it and understanding, all of us have a strength. Like that's just where it's at. So if you're looking at an early time in your life, you're like, well, Michael, I'm only 12. Do I really need to do this? Yes, yes, you
Mhm.
do. Because
Mhm.
there's certain strengths you have right now that if I knew what I know now about learning, I would have started to do it before because I was
Mhm.
like, you know what? Let me embrace a strength because we always talk about strengths and weaknesses, but
Mhm.
it's always better to improve a strength versus try to build up a weakness because your weakness may never get all the way up to that
Mhm.
satisfactory level, but your strength is what can take you to stages. Your strength is what can help you lead your family. Your strength is what can make you that valedictorian in your school.
Mhm.
So you have to kind of know your strengths early on, at least have an idea because they do change, but
Mhm.
embrace the ones that are right there.
Right. Well, and I have talked to kids about using their strengths and talking to their teachers about their strengths so they can make
Mhm.
school work for them. Because sometimes we are in a class that, is just not, it's our weakness and we're not sure like how to approach it. But if you look at your strengths and how can you use those strengths to do this thing that doesn't feel as comfortable or you're not as good at, you're just gonna do better because you're gonna feel so much better about what's going on. And I have found with my clients being teenagers, they're like, "Oh, I didn't know I could talk to my teacher about how I learn or what would work for me in the classroom." Of
Mhm.
course you can. Now that doesn't mean all teachers listen. We have, people are people and we don't always,
Correct.
get somebody that's super open to all of that stuff, but we always have the right to ask for those things in our life or with our coworkers or with our
Mhm.
boss or, we can say these are the things that work best for me and I'd really like to approach it this way. And I feel like sometimes part of my job is just helping young people see the power and control they do have in their lives when it feels like they don't. Because it feels like all these adults are telling them what to do, or all these people have all the rules and they have to follow them. But we have a lot of control over that and agency with that, even as minors, even as young people. And so I want kids to see that. So in your talks, do you talk to schools at all? Or are you mostly doing professional speaking with adults, or how does that work?
I typically find myself with adults. I
Mhm.
just because of especially law enforcement being my predominant industry, that's about 85 to 90% of my business that I do with my speaking. It tends to be adults. Now I've spoken to kids in the past and I'm never opposed to it, but everybody has to have a certain industry that they focus on.
Mhm.
And I say that to say you can't do everything.
Mhm.
So
Right.
like people might like, oh, I could talk to kids, I could talk to adults, I could talk to young adults, I could talk to people late in their career, I could talk to senior citizens. You can, but you need to at least focus on one at a time. And then if other
Mhm.
groups come and say, you know what, we heard your message to these adults, can you bring it to the kids? Then yes, I will do it.
Mhm.
But typically, I don't find myself speaking to too many groups of children.
Okay. Well, and that makes sense with being in law enforcement. I mean, young people have to, if you're going to talk about that particular field, sometimes then kids need to have more experience or they need to be adults that are going into that career. I have a client who wants to go into law enforcement. She's just a freshman in high school, but she's done the UMAP. And what we found out from her was that what her number, well, I don't know if it's her number one, but in her top five, she has command as her strength. And command
Impressive.
is the rarest strength in all the 34. And how it usually comes across with her is bossy. And so she keeps getting in trouble at school because she's trying to tell everyone what to do. And when she found out it was a strength, we were like, how can you use this? That yes,
Correct.
you can overuse it if you're, coming across as bossy, but we talk about how can you use that strength and, have it be a strength. And I keep telling her, in going into law enforcement, command will be super important. Like that'll be one of your things you're going to want to make sure in the job interview that you talk about is that command is a strength for you. And she said, I love chaos because I make sense of the chaos. Like if there's a lot of drama going on in my class or my family's kind of falling off the rails, she said, I just walk in, take control of the situation, talk about what needs to happen next. And I'm like, that's amazing. Like, what 14-year-old can do that?
And the fact that you're helping her recognize that early is very helpful because That's one thing that helped me out in high school is that I forgot how I got to. Well, my sister went to the and well, she went to high school before I did, so I already knew I was going to go to that technical school. But I forgot if there was an assessment I had to take to pick that particular field. But the high school I went to had different what we called academies back then. Some
Mm-hmm.
people were criminal justice like myself. Some people were business administration. Some people were agricultural. So kind of what you were kind of thinking you want to do as an adult, it started to prepare you early on. But for her, the fact that she has command, like you said, that helps out a lot of law enforcement because a lot of times you have to go to different scenes and different calls, and having that command presence is what's going to help you lead and help people get over their chaotic situation, whatever that might be. So that's very good
Mm-hmm.
that she knows
Mm-hmm.
that early.
Yeah, I'm excited that she found this out by doing self-awareness. So one of the things you said to me is you help people or talk about purpose and how purpose has something to do with our lives. So tell us about that.
It's crazy because depends on where you go to school, depends on the jobs you take early on. A lot of us associate ourselves with an organization. Like we associate our identity as a company.
Mm,
And what you end up running into is fatigue, burnout, stress, because you think that company is going to fulfill you, which I have found out is completely wrong. And
mhm,
I love all the organizations I've worked with, the ones I work for, but I found myself identifying myself as an agency. So, for example, let's say in law enforcement, a lot of times you will hear people introduce themselves as Officer Michael Laidler or Sergeant Michael Laidler, Chief Michael Laidler, whatever that might be.
mhm,
For me, for a psychological standpoint, I'm like, well, no, you need to identify yourself first and then your title. And a lot of people have a hard time doing that because for so long they identified themselves as that organization. So for me, when it comes down to purpose, you have to identify who comes first when it comes to your learning needs. And for me, it starts off with me. I can't be that good father. I can't be a good spouse. I can't be a good son. I can't be a good brother if I don't know who I am as a person. So for
mhm,
me, the purpose starts off with developing myself consistently, then looking out for my family, then the organization. A lot of us have it flipped wrong. A lot of us say, well, the organization is first. And we may not even say it out loud, but we know actions speak louder than words. If you
mhm,
find yourself at work 60 to 80 hours a week, which is very common, especially
mhm,
as an educator, especially during the
mhm,
school year, you find
mhm,
yourself working from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. mostly every Monday through Friday. And then
mhm,
a summer they call it a break, but it's just a recovery period.
mhm,
But but truly, and that's not if you're not doing summer school or tutoring. But for me, the purpose, one of the things I tell people about is I want you to start looking at yourself as important. I want you to
mhm,
start valuing yourself because the purpose of a lot of things we should be doing should start with us. And people always say and look, well, is that's kind of selfish. Well, you have to be selfish about your growth. How do you be a good teacher? How do you be a good police officer? How do you be a good doctor if you don't study what you need to? If you don't study
mhm,
about yourself, if you don't know your strengths, let's go back to that. If you know
mhm,
you're a learner, but you're not building up that learning side by reading or developing yourself in that area, how do you get any better to now deliver it to that company? Because
mhm,
if you only know 80% of what you should, but you can know 100%, what do you think that organization is going to benefit more? 80% of Michael Laidler or 100% of Cynthia? Like,
mhm,
which one is going to be better? So, when it comes down to the purpose side of what I say, one of the purposes is that you owe it to yourself. You owe it to grow each and every day, every week, every month. Because if you want to fulfill anybody else, if you want to help anybody else out, you have to have that strength in yourself before you can pass it on to anybody else.
mhm. I love that so much because as you were talking about that, I was thinking about how many of my clients have lost themselves in a relationship too. You're talking
Yeah.
about losing yourself in a job where you're so identified in the job itself that
Mhm.
you're not getting your own needs met. People do that in relationships too.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of times, and I've said this so often in different episodes of my podcast, that we look out to the world to fulfill us in some way. I want a whole bunch of likes on Instagram, or I want, you want these different accolades or things coming from the outside to shore us up inside, but we need to be shored up inside. And then those other things will probably just be icing on the cake.
Mhm.
But and I tell that about when I talk about relationships, especially romantic relationships, but sometimes people get mixed up in their friendships too, but
Of course.
you need to know who you are and love who you are, and then that romantic partner or that friendship is just icing on the cake. It's just part of it. They don't complete you, because looking at things like looking at jobs to complete you or looking at relationships to complete you is never going to happen, because that's a lot of pressure to put on that job, or that's a lot of pressure to put on a person to complete
Mhm.
you when you're really the only person who can do that. So that is just a whole nother important concept that I've learned in my adulthood
Mhm.
and wished I would have known it before. And I love that you're talking about that with other people too, with adults. But anytime we're educating adults on these things, it's trickling down to the young people, because they
Of
have young
course.
people in their lives, whether their own children or their neighbors, or they work in a school system. Because I noticed that we have a similar friend on LinkedIn. It's a school resource officer that I know. You're also friends with them, and maybe he heard your talk. I haven't asked him how he knows you, but you're linked in LinkedIn. And so if you're talking to law enforcement officers, you're probably talking to school resource officers
Mhm.
sometimes, or a lot of the times. And those, once they learn these concepts, they can use them with the young people that they have in their schools. So I think that is great. And I'm just glad that kids can see, and their parents, because a lot of my listeners are parents, that the concepts that I have been teaching in my podcast the whole time and what I do in my own coaching
Mhm.
practice is exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and it takes time. I mean, I've been through a divorce. You learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about self-awareness through that. And
Me
trust me,
too.
nobody wants to go through that necessarily,
Right.
but you learn about life, you learn about hard days, you learn about how to recover, you learn how to kind of start over sometimes, depends on what phase of life you in. Look at relationships like you said. I mean, go back to being a teenager. You probably have a boyfriend, girlfriend, or you have someone that you're close to, even if it's just a good friend. And to cultivate that relationship, to make it the best, you have to still know yourself. You have
Yes.
to know what's going to work. You have to know what you're willing to compromise, what you're
Yep.
not willing to compromise. And sometimes we're like, oh, we're just going to bend over backwards for this person, but you're going to be unhappy. And then over time, that stress, that anticipation, that anxiety is going to eventually come out because you've been holding so much back. So going back again to self-awareness, it's the foundation for
Mhm.
a lot of, if not everything you're going to do in your life, because to fully be involved with anything you do, it starts with you.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. Well, I'm actually getting ready to rebrand. Well, probably when this comes out, I will have already rebranded it, but I'm rebranding my podcast and to be more specific to anxiety, because all of my clients have come to me originally because of anxiety. We don't always stick with that because they work on that and we start working on some other things. But, and all parents that wherever I'm talking live or any questions I get on social media is always about anxiety. And working in the school system for 31 years, a lot of kids and a lot of adults had anxiety. So I wanted to ask if you have any kind of good tools or techniques or strategies you use, because anxiety is natural and normal and everyone has it. But what do you do so to help it not get out of control or put barriers up in your life?
Well, for me, sometime when it comes to anxiety, one of the things that I find it coming up most prevalent in is public speaking.
Mm,
And I have people always say, well, Michael, how do you speak in front of hundreds of people? How do you speak in front of 5 people? And I say, well, I have anxiety just like you do. I just learned to manage it. I've learned to recognize when I'm have sweaty palms, or like I start to have those, like my thoughts like jumbled up in my head, when I have the back sweat, whatever it might be, the
mhm,
heart racing fast. It's about learning to manage it ahead of time. So one of
mhm,
the things that I teach people is just breathe. Like I do some breathing techniques. Like one thing I call, and I have it in my book, called the 6 second method, is you breathe in for 6 seconds, you breathe out for 6 seconds. You do that 10 times, and you're going to find yourself getting into a level of stronger mindfulness, because you've been able to focus everything on the moment. Now, it's not perfect in the sense of it's going to be your magic formula, but sometimes just slowing everything down and removing yourself from whatever situation is creating that anxiety helps out. Now, if you're speaking in front of a group of people, you can't just say, "Hey, give me a minute. I'll be back in 5 minutes." But
mhm.
if it's something that you know you're coming up to, do the breathing exercises ahead of time. Take
Mhm.
that 5 to 10 minutes before you start speaking to somebody. Let's say you're just having that one-on-one conversation with your friend, and you know that it's giving you anxiety, it's building up in you. Well, take 5 to 10 minutes before that conversation and just breathe.
Mhm.
Focus literally on breathing. Now, I'm not a meditation person myself, so I can't tell you to sit there and do it for 30 minutes because I can't sit for that long,
Mhm.
but I can do something for 5 to 10 minutes consistently. And there was some study, or I heard a speaker earlier this year, and she's a psychologist, and when she talked about like the practice of mindfulness and reducing things like anxiety, I want to say she said to practice mindfulness, if you practice it for 63 days in a row, that's when it becomes impactful to like what you're actually doing. So if you're looking at managing your anxiety, controlling it, because you can't stop it.
Mm-mm.
Let's not I don't want to say you're just gonna be able to stop it, because I get anxiety whenever I speak. But
Mhm.
I've learned how to calm myself down ahead of time. So what I do is that breathing technique. So you're gonna do it over time to start getting your body used to it. So when you feel that anxiety building up, you can say, okay, what can I go back to? If I can, let me go do that 6 second method Michael talked about, or maybe
Mhm.
something Cynthia's talked about as well. But
Mhm.
anxiety is a real thing, and it can really throw off everything you're doing. But knowing that it's coming, but knowing you have techniques in place, for me has helped it be more manageable. Now, don't get me wrong, there's higher level anxieties and things that require other techniques. I don't have that, so I cannot
Mhm.
speak on that extensive
Mhm.
of a area. But if it's anxiety where you can manage it, just breathing really works out really well. Control breathing and understanding how to do it.
Mhm. Exactly. Well, and I have talked about that too, and probably will continue to talk about that. There is
Mhm.
some people who have chemical imbalances where,
Correct.
it does go out of control and just like simple techniques might not work. But the simple techniques will also help, even if you have that kind where you have to take
Mhm.
medication or you're getting
Right.
therapy or you're doing some really intense things. You can still pair that kind of anxiety with breathing techniques and different thought changes that you might have, because those things are still going to help. And that's what I love about these anxiety techniques that everyone can use, because even if you have the next level, which I don't have either, so I also don't understand it in the same way, but my
Mhm.
daughter has that more diagnosable taking medication kind of anxiety.
Right.
And so I've been around it, and I've talked to her a lot about how that works. And so these techniques still help her. She just needs that extra layer that comes from a mental health or medical professional. So, but I'm glad that you said that you feel anxiety even though you are a public speaker, because
Yeah.
I understand that, and I tell kids all the time, like, they're like, "Well, I don't know how you can get in front of people because I can't." And I'm like, "Well, everyone can, and I'm still scared. I just do it anyway."
All
And
the time.
that's part of that regulation of I regulate it enough. So even though when I'm standing in front of people, my leg might be shaking or my thoughts might be saying, "You don't know what you're talking
Mhm.
about. You shouldn't be up here," whatever, those kinds of things. The people that are watching don't know that that's happening. They don't see that that's what my brain is saying, or they don't see that my leg was shaking. And many times they'll say, "Oh, you look so calm." And I think, well, good. I'm glad I looked that way because I certainly wasn't calm. So it is just a way, you can learn how to go forward even if you're feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah, and on that, with the public speaking side, I always tell people, anybody that I'm trained on presentation skills or coaching, is think about it. When you're standing up there speaking in front of others, if when you're in that audience, think about what you're telling yourself. You're saying, "Thank goodness it's not me to be up there. Thank goodness
Mhm.
I'm not the one speaking." So when you're standing up there, think about how many people are thinking the same exact thing that you're thinking. They're like, "Thank goodness I'm not up there." So for me,
Mhm.
a lot of times my anxiety comes from not from being like fearful of standing in front of people anymore. It's if I don't deliver them quality information. Like if I can't impact them, because that's what I'm aiming for nowadays. I really want to see people grow. So for me, my anxiety comes from, did I give them enough? Did I leave them enough? Did I give them enough information that can change their lives? So that's
Mhm.
kind of where mine comes from. But it's still impacts me because I'm still nervous because I don't want to mess up. And practice
Mhm.
helps out a lot too. If you're looking at public speaking of at any level, practicing whatever you have to talk about goes a far way because you're
Mhm.
working through those nerves because everybody's going to feel a little anxious. But if you know what you're talking about, you're not going to be as anxious. I can promise you that.
Mhm. Yeah, well, it takes away a tiny bit of the fear of the unknown. I think a lot of
Mm,
my clients have that fear of the unknown. Like, I don't know
mhm,
what it's gonna be like when I'm on that stage, so then I don't wanna do it. But, yeah, we can't totally know exactly what it's gonna be like until the time, but if you've
mhm,
practiced it, you have a feel for what you're saying, and that will feel like, "Oh, I already have done this. I already know what this is gonna be like." At least you'll already know what your talk is gonna be like, even if you don't know the whole other part of the experience. So what do you want to leave my audience with, the parents and the kids? Like, what is it that you want them to know the most about you or your program or how they could contact you and those kinds of things?
Well, for anybody looking to contact me, you can find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, or YouTube at Michael Laidler. And the way my name is spelled, it's just literally the at sign Michael Laidler. There's no other letters in between, no dots, no nothing. I put a lot of content on LinkedIn, not as much so on IG. I don't get as much on there, probably 3 or 4 times a week. And then usually YouTube, I have either my podcast posted on there or different leadership trainings. So for me, what I really want people to start doing consistently is working on themselves daily. I think that's been one of the biggest impacts on my life is working on myself and truly like not letting things distract me because there's so many different distractions in our lives, friends, families, social media, driving to work, trying to get a job, whatever it might be. You have to go back to where it all starts. It all starts with you. Are you going to fail at things? Absolutely. Are you going to strike out in life on some things? Of course. But knowing that that's coming is going to help you overcome it. Because
Mhm.
if you're still breathing today, if you're watching this podcast, you're listening to the podcast, you still have a chance to make things
Mhm.
better. You
Mhm.
don't the when you run out of chances is when you're not alive anymore. That's when you're out of chances. Every day you have a different chance. So even if you feel like you're having your worst day right now, know that the days can get better. And it may not get better right the next day, maybe not the next week, but it will over time. And you got to keep pushing yourself. And I think
Mhm.
that's where so many of us lose hope and lose sight is because we look at our current situation and we don't see a way out.
Mhm.
I can't tell you and I cannot promise you when that's going to come, but when that situation comes, you have to be ready for it. And how do you
Mhm.
get ready? Learning about yourself, studying, staying in school, getting good grades, listening to adults, parents, listening to your kids, because
Mhm.
that day is going to come where you're going to get that big opportunity of whatever size it might be. It might just be finding religion. And when you find religion, if that might be the change in your life, or you might say you might find your spouse,
Mhm.
whatever it is, you have to be ready, but you're not going to be ready if you're not focused on yourself and like building yourself up because preparation is going to be what's going to get you over a lot of different things because in law enforcement, we're hit with different obstacles each and every day. A lot of them aren't our obstacles, but we have to overcome it. I mean, things I went through, bad traffic crashes, babies dying in my arms. I
Mm.
mean, I wasn't ready for that, but it was part of the job and I had to overcome it and continue on because more people needed me to be better. So
Mhm.
that now comes from continuously growing, continuously building myself up and being that leader to me so I could be a leader to others.
Mhm. I love that so much. Well, I am so glad you were joining us today. I want everyone to know about there's so like think about how many humans in this world are just out there to help people. And I think sometimes we don't realize that there's so many people that we can turn to and get help from. And so I want my audience to know that there's lots of people and who are
Mhm.
they and how do I get in contact with them? So I'll put all of your links in my
Thank you.
notes as well. And I'm just glad that you joined us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. And I can tell you guys, hey, if you ever want me to come to wherever you're at, hey, I love traveling. So I'm always down to come speak, whatever it's a 30-minute keynote or 8 hour workday, whatever it might be. I'm always in.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Well, I will definitely keep you in mind for that.
Perfect. Thank you, Cynthia.
Sure.